As we talked about earlier, we're going to go ahead and have opening comments and go around the table, so to speak, in order. It's very orderly and organized. And then we'll let the discussion go on from there. So, Ferrel?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having us here. I want to begin with a commercial. The comments I'm going to make are supported with a big chunk of data and PowerPoint and some other material. And you can find it at this website. It's the website of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It's jomc.unc.edu/red states and purple states. And if you go to that site, you can find other material about what I'm going to talk about. And so I want to begin by just talking about why did we title this Red States and Purple States, to think about the South as it is today, not just the South of stereotypes and myths. For a long time in American politics, the South could be described as mostly unified, as one thing, in the sense that it was a one-party region for much of the 20th century. First, it was a one-party Democratic region. It was a time of segregation, a time of small-scale industry and row crop agriculture. And the South was dominated, particularly by rural leaders. There was a period of transition, of disruption, of change through the 50s and 60s, marked by the Brown v. Board decision on school desegregation, marked by the rise of conservative Christians in politics, marked by in the end, the Voting Rights Act that brought black citizens into the electorate in the South after having been excluded mostly for more than half a century. That period of disruption resulted in two things at once: the rise of New South governors and the implementation of a Republican Southern strategy. And the two parties at that time shifted in the way they were cast, so that the Republican Party became increasingly the party of white Southerners, and the Democratic Party became a biracial coalition. And so where we've ended up now is this. Barack Obama won the electoral votes of 3 southern states in 2008. He, as at least a little bit, picked the lock of the Republican South. He won North Carolina, Virginia, and Florida. And his election illustrated how the South is not just one thing anymore, so that the inner South, states like Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi and Tennessee and Arkansas, in some respects became more Republican, while states on the East Coast became more Democratic. And there are a couple of explanations of this. One is the states on the Atlantic seaboard side of the South grew robustly. North Carolina grew by more than 18%, higher than the national growth rate during the 2000-2010 census period. That growth brought into the state white Americans, black Americans, and Latinos who have begun forming large, robust metropolitan areas. And so Obama's victory in North Carolina and the other states rested on 3 factors: the rise of metropolitan North Carolina, the metropolitan South, the votes of young people. 70% of young voters, 18 to 27, 28, 70% of those voters in North Carolina voted for Obama. And nearly all black people voted for Obama. In fact, the exit poll in North Carolina has one of the great findings of polling. It cannot be correct, but it says that 100% of black women voted for Obama. Now, there must have been a black woman somewhere who didn't. But what that poll says is every black woman who was polled said that she voted for Obama. And so that extraordinary combination of events led to Obama's victory. And so as we look at 2012, we once again see that states on the eastern seaboard, particularly Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida, are in play. They are battleground states. And the question is whether Obama can get that kind of turnout again. Those states will be hotly contested. There will be very close races. The real puzzle, and for me at least, is Texas. Texas is likely to stay Republican, but Texas fits all of the ingredients. You know, its demographic change is very similar. In fact, it's even more robust than the states on the East Coast. A lot of population growth, population diversity, big, huge metropolitan areas. But Texas has stayed stubbornly Republican, and in my view, if the Democrats ever crack Texas, it'll be akin to the Democrats' success in cracking California 20 years ago. And so that's the playing field right now, and I'll be happy to answer your questions and talk further about those aspects of the campaign.
Are you finished?
I'm finished.
Gene?
I hate to follow Ferrel because his voice is so Louisiana lilt that I kind of go into a trance, and so.
Yeah, he's just stunned because I talked about Texas.
No, I'm stunned that you kept within the timelines. That's what I didn't plan for. Different than Ferrel. First of all, Ferrel accurately says that his talk is supported by a great deal of data and scholarly research. I'm a lawyer, so virtually by definition, my talk will not be supported by a great deal of data and research, though I do have a few data points that I want to emphasize. It's also true that following Ferrel, if Ferrel speaks about the metropolitanization and the kind of hopeful changes of the South, my emphasis is a little more on some of the crankiness about the South, a little more considering an example in which we are more like the old South than I think all of us wish we were. It's my task to talk about poverty, sort of the famously ignored issue of American politics, what I think, unabashedly, is the scourge of our national life, very powerful and high levels of poverty in the richest nation on earth, levels of poverty far more pronounced than other advanced Western democracies, much greater now levels of economic inequality than other advanced Western democracies, more challenging economic mobility than other Western democracies, and yet all of these things notwithstanding, we just had a political convention last week in which poverty was surely never addressed or expressed. I mentioned yesterday during the Republican convention, the new statistics on uninsured in the United States came out. They revealed that Florida now had more than 25% of its members, of its citizens, with no health care coverage at all. That was not fitting to mention during the convention in Tampa, and I don't imagine that this convention will be very much different on that front, or at least not as much different as I wish it was. I'm also to talk a bit about, or maybe dominantly about, since this is a discussion of the American South and politics, about the relationship between poverty and politics in the South, particularly. So I'll try to move sort of quickly through that venture. I've mentioned a couple times in the past that I'm a big fan of the Western writer Wallace Stegner, who characterizes the West as the native home of hope in the United States. And I think he means that in both appealing ways and cranky ways. I think it's not unfair to sort of borrow that language and describe the South as the native home of poverty, which means that we have and always have had more poor people in the South. And I would add, maybe more controversially, more political leaders who are utterly untroubled by it than the rest of the country. And that's sort of the point I want to emphasize. You understand the national picture, at least a lot of us do. We have over 15% of Americans living in poverty nationally, 47, 48 millions, the highest in raw numbers probably in our history, the highest on a percentage basis in over 20 years. Those figures are worse by race, so if you're Black, Native American, Latino, about 30% live in poverty. They're worse, also to our embarrassment, by age. The younger, the more vulnerable, the greater the level of poverty. 22% of all American kids live in poverty in North Carolina, over 25% of our kids. And maybe worst of all in that unpacking, in North Carolina, 40% of children of color live in poverty. I think sort of a concession of failure on our part as a Commonwealth. The South is worse than the rest of the country on this front. If you use the census numbers, about 17% of folks in the South live in poverty. The rest of the country ranges from maybe 12 to 15%. We have far more people uninsured in the South than the rest of the country, over 19%. Those figures running from 12 to 17 in the rest of the country. Pointedly, this week, Florida having over 25%, Texas 26% uninsured, Massachusetts 4% uninsured, thanks to Governor Romney's earlier sins and transgressions. The states with the highest poverty rate in the United States, 8 out of 10 are southern states, often much higher levels of poverty than other states. Mississippi, over 30%. 10 states in the United States have child poverty levels of over 25%, and 9 of those are in the South. Kids in extreme poverty, there are 6 million in the United States. That's living at half the level of income, so $11,000 for a family of 4. Of those 6 million, 42%, a greatly disproportionate percentage, live in the South. And states with 10% of kids living in extreme poverty, there are 11 of those in America, and 10 of them are in the South. The Pew just released a study finding the most challenging economic mobility. They found the least mobility exists in Louisiana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Texas. And this is not getting better, it's getting worse. In the last census data, the South had a more significant rise on these levels than other parts of the country. Why would I add to it, or how would I try to add to it the notion that we seem to be less troubled by poverty policy, less drawn to poverty policies than other parts of the country? Well, you can use a million different examples. We are, in our politics, less congenial to concerns over poverty. Of late, there was a sort of disproportionate desire to turn back stimulus funds from politicians in the South. There was oddly great opposition to the Affordable Care Act in the South, the states with the largest numbers of uninsured, who you would think, in fact, who would benefit the most by the Affordable Care Act, seemed, in a sense, speaking broadly, the most resolutely opposed to it. In the months ahead, we will continue to play out this Medicaid expansion question, where the question of the willingness of southern states or other states as a whole to buy into the Medicaid expansion has indicated that those states which would benefit the most, largely in the South, are frequently the most opposed. Why is it? And I'll sort of stop with that question. Why is it that the South is less congenial to efforts to alleviate poverty? We've debated that for at least 100 years in the South. W.J. Cash, V.O. Key, Bob Dylan, only a pawn in their game. I would say this. First of all, the South has in common with the rest of the country now the sort of horrible aspect of our politics that we ignore and take off the agenda the bottom 30%. They sort of don't count. They're not, they're an aspect of poverty being invisible. And that's certainly no less true in the South than it is in the rest of the country. I think the South has the sort of what's the matter with Kansas challenge in that social conservatives join with economic conservatives and then end up not getting the sort of social conservative part of the bargain, but do go along with taking economic interests of poor people off the table. And then last and finally, I think it's fair to say that the South, the discussions over poverty policies, discussions over governmental actions which might alleviate poverty are even more racialized in the South than they are in the rest of the country. So I think we end up with the politics that allows, accepts highest levels of poverty, and seems less inclined to demand political leaders, and I think that's true of this presidential campaign. Even though the South is the poorest, even though the poverty is a great issue in the South, I don't think we're going to see any hue and cry for electoral candidates which clamor to do something about it. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Kareem?
Thank you. And I have to confess, I forgot the cardinal rule, which is never to follow up Gene Nichol on the panel. And I have the added duty of following him and Ferrel Guillory up. So I'm going to do what I can in discussing some of the issues that are related to the election structure and how they influence the South and are likely to play a role in the upcoming election. I'm going to actually pick up on a point that Gene finished with involving V.O. Key. He is, I think, by all accounts, if you're in political science, or for that matter in law school, any scholar on the South and politics turns to that as a starting point. And one of the fundamental observations he made, which will probably not shock anyone if you hear it, is one essential feature of Southern politics at the time he was looking, 1940s, 1930s, was that race often drove most decision making. And at that time, race was understood as the exclusion of what he would define as Negroes, Black Americans. And who won and who lost often depended on who could outdo the other at saying, well, we really want to keep African Americans out of the political system. As Ferrel pointed out in his slides, which I hope you get a chance to look at, really showing great detail, the Voting Rights Act, adopted in 1965, had a massive shift in the politics of the South, although the shifts were complex. In its first iteration, it enfranchised a great number of African Americans in states throughout the South. But what it also did, as again Ferrel has pointed out in other places and certainly in the graphs, it shifted a large segment of the white Southern vote away from the Democratic Party, their sort of longtime allies, to the Republican Party, which was a slow but sure process. And that's the political scene that we inherit today, where generally speaking, the South has sort of been a foothold for the Republican Party, largely due to strong support from white Southerners. but you also have a significant and fairly unified, strong Democratic vote House, mostly within the African American community and with allied groups. One interesting point in what Ferrel brought up earlier about the way in which 2008 was different was 3 of the states that were usually in the Republican column went in the Democrats this time around. Yet North Carolina, being one of the 3, was different, even among those 3 states that went blue last time. And I wanted to start with that point to explain some different ways in which I think across the South, but certainly here in North Carolina, the question about how the election system is going to be organized will very seriously affect, I think, the likelihood that either Barack Obama or Mitt Romney wins the next election. North Carolina is distinct among those states that went blue in 2008 insofar as it really in many ways is the sort of last bastion of Democratic strength. If you go back and look at the number of governors that have been elected, North Carolina, unlike the other states, has had 12 uninterrupted years of Democratic control of the governor's chair. It's not something you see elsewhere. At the same time, and this is quite tied to the first point, it is actually a place that has a pretty robust pattern of racial cooperation, coalitions that exist among African Americans and white voters. If you're looking for evidence of it, you can look at the legislature that has just now ended its session. In the state Senate, every African American member of that chamber comes from a district where the majority of their voters are white. So, looking at North Carolina in light of what happened in 2008, it's not all that surprising that Barack Obama was able to put a coalition together because those coalitions in many ways existed at levels lower than the statewide races for president. But that is an issue now that is at risk. And I want to talk about 3 different ways in which I think the election system is trying to work against those coalitions from enduring. The first way in which it is now being sort of attacked is in the redistricting process, and it's sort of the most direct way in which it's being challenged. And I should mention in all 3 respects, these are efforts that are engineered by Republicans, perhaps for partisan gains. There are arguments that there are other issues at play as well, but certainly in the race for partisanship, Republicans have identified African Americans and their alliances with similarly minded Democrat to moderate voters as being a threat to their continued control of a lot of seats, or perhaps an attempt to control political offices here in North Carolina. And they've managed to do it in the redistricting process, then the term just ended. What they managed to do in the process was to reorganize these existing districts that had coalitions of African Americans and white voters, and because of their interpretation of federal law, claimed that they needed to create as many majority African American districts as possible. What did that mean in practice? It meant breaking apart many of these districts and sandwiching absolutely every African American voter that you could find in a super Democratic district. Looking at Congress, which might be the easiest place to look, currently there are 7 Democrats, 6 Republicans, fairly organized east-west across the state. That has been totally reorganized in some, I didn't bring maps, but feel free to take a look. There are districts that join metropolitan areas that have never been joined before in an effort to put Democratic voters, largely African American, in these districts. And the proposed change that will come if the election goes as predicted is that there will be 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats, 2 of them African American, in the next Congress. There are any number of ironies here, but let me just point out the fact that the Republicans are doing this on the argument that the Voting Rights Act requires them to do it, and that federal law has to reign supreme over state law. You won't see many places where the Republicans are making that argument, but they're making it here. The second area that I want to talk about in terms of the contestation over the election structure is about early voting. Last time around, the Obama campaign was masterful, frankly, at using their resources to get people out and locking in votes very early. That was largely, in a lot of states, Florida is among them, a process that was utilized by African Americans. You'd see a lot of folks showing up on Sunday for church. They'd have buses to ship people from the church to the polling place. And that was quite effective at locking up votes. In many cases, that was more than the margin of victory in states, certainly like in North Carolina, where the difference was 14,000 between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. In a lot of states now, partly because of economic belt tightening, they say, a lot of Republican legislators are trying to cut back on the availability of early voting. In some cases, they're cutting out Sunday voting. In other cases, they're relying on counties to make those judgments. And in many counties where they know there's going to be a competitive race and they know that there are a large number of African Americans, a lot of administrators are saying, well, we're not going to make it as available as before. That's going to make these opportunities less likely for African Americans and likely other Democratic minded voters to get out and lock in votes. The last point, the type of voting rule that is being contested at the moment is something that is happening around the country involving voter ID. Many states, all of them involving Republican legislatures in the South, are making the argument that you have to have a government-issued photo ID of a particular type in order to qualify to cast a ballot. That's not something that's been supported by any evidence of fraud, yet a number of scholars have concluded that the people who are least likely to have that ID at the moment are African Americans, poor voters, older voters. And in order to obtain it, many times it involves taking a lot of time and effort to get to an agency, and in many cases it requires money to do it. And people have argued in a variety of contexts that this is essentially a poll tax. That, and in many places, is being litigated. In Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court is dealing with it. In the South, it has a particular valence because in the South, you can't adopt changes in many states without getting federal approval for them because of the Voting Rights Act. And many of you may know that Texas was denied permission to adopt one of these statutes because the court concluded that there were differential burdens that are placed on the old and non-white voters. I mentioned the Voting Rights Act again because this is actually the big kahuna for all of this effort to change the election system. The Republicans, notwithstanding their reliance on it in the redistricting process, have made the argument that the Voting Rights Act, at least this provision that requires federal approval, is itself unconstitutional. So one of the things that they're trying to take to the United States Supreme Court is the argument, and the court has been receptive to these arguments in the past, is that it no longer is necessary in today's politics for southern local governments and state governments to go hand in hand to the federal government for approval. So many of these arguments are going to, I think, affect how likely it is that average voters are going to be able to cast ballots. It will certainly be of concern to the Obama administration and the campaign to make sure that voters who, because of race aren't permitted to cast a ballot are at least not denied without a fight in court. So I think going forward, we're going to see this fight taken to the United States Supreme Court, and I think it's hard to know whether we're going to get an answer that is favorable or not before the election. But right now, I think the big question presented to most of the folks who think about this a lot is, are we at a stage now where we can say that, the world that Key explored in the 1940s is no longer present, or whether we're just seeing a different version of it that has the same significant effect for African Americans. So I'll stop there.
I was thinking how happy Lyndon Johnson would be that the Voting Rights Act is now the big kahuna.
Well, I think what I want to talk about today is something that complements very nicely what Ferrel and Gene and Kareem were talking about, which is the organization of campaigns and their strategies. Demographic changes are not destiny. Legal institutions are not destiny. Campaigns still need to bring those people who sympathize with them to the polls. They need to come up with messages that engage supporters, that help supporters realize their interests are aligned with a particular candidate. And all of this requires the extensive field efforts, the field campaigns that a number of people have spoken about, and also increasingly leveraging a new array of new media technologies, everything from websites to mobile applications, all the way down to things like online advertising, which we're seeing a lot about today, all of which is really meant to somehow inspire supporters, get volunteers, raise money, build field offices, and coordinate the extensive efforts that are required to do things like contest elections in states such as North Carolina, which are decided by the slimmest of margins. So in a lot of what I'm talking about, I'm going to be talking about getting marginal advantages. This is about turning out a couple of extra thousand people at the polls than the next side. But those marginal advantages are quite consequential, as we saw in 2008 in terms of the Obama campaign being able to win North Carolina. The broadest point that I want to make today, though, is that really the history of the uptake of new media in politics has really been about campaigns and parties seeking really to harness the power of what is a global medium for the ends of really doing geographic-based work, given the dictates of the electoral system. And we can see this as campaigns increasingly using new media to do things like create and sustain energy and to coordinate supporters towards the ends that campaigns need. And electoral math is pretty ruthless. Campaigns require certain things. They require money, they require volunteers, and they ultimately require votes. And all these things are tied to geographic locations. And I think one of the big successes of the Obama campaign in 2008 was figuring out how do we take essentially this vast medium and make it work for us geographically? How does it work to coordinate and generate volunteers on the ground? How does it work to gain resources from people living in swing states such as North Carolina? And tremendous amounts of investment in both parties, on the Democratic side between 2004 and 2008, and then on both sides, continuing that investment leading up to 2012, has been in sort of figuring out how to use things like email, like Twitter, like apps, et cetera, to keep supporters excited and engaged and to get them working for particular candidates. And indeed, supporters can engage in these sorts of efforts on their own using things like group functionalities on both of the campaign's websites to do things like organize their own communities for the candidates, pulling down voter file lists, contact sheets, et cetera, to be able to sort of go door to door to talk to their friends and neighbors. And I want to just sort of pull back a bit and say much of what we have seen over the last decade and a half that is qualitatively new is a reinvestment in field efforts. And by field efforts, I mean ground, door-to-door campaigning and canvassing. We tend to forget that really from the era of the 1960s on, it was dominated by what political scientists and other people would refer to as air wars. And that's really vast expenditures going to purchasing things like television advertising, to the extent that campaigns neglected a lot of those ground turnout operations. This began to change in the late 90s, early 2000s, and really it was driven by a couple of different things. First of all, consultants on both sides realized there was increasing media fragmentation. So whereas in the 60s you could buy, ad space on 3 networks and reach, 80, 90% of the electorate, now with the rise of cable broadcasting and now things like internet consumption, the Romney campaign has been talking about estimating as much as 30% of the electorate is no longer watching live television. That's a vast shift, which essentially means campaigns need to figure out how to get to people where they are. And one of the ways that they did this was through field campaigning. And this is old door-to-door, getting walk lists, target lists, et cetera, enlisting supporters and volunteers. And these are massive efforts that require thousands and thousands and thousands of volunteers, and getting them working to do things such as identify supporters, register voters, persuade undecideds, and beginning October 18th here in North Carolina, as Kareem mentioned, early voting, which is campaigns wanting to bank as many votes as possible. And the marginal advantages from being able to do that in a really effective way are enormous. And that's why campaigns on both sides of the aisle really work to maximize that. The important thing I think that we really see is new tools getting yoked to these older forms of political campaigning. And I'll just say a little bit about this. First of all, better data. And I think you've seen this on both sides of the aisle over the last decade. Republicans and Democrats have invested in creating these enormous national voter databases. And these voter databases are made up of a number of different sources of data. There's public data, such as party registration, turnout history, that kind of stuff. We have lots of commercial data that are in these databases, so things like credit card records, grocery club card purchases, et cetera. And then Canvas data. And I think this is one of the underappreciated facts of the 2008 campaign. Obama had an enormous field effort. And every one of those voter IDs and voter contacts, the campaign now in 2012 has at their disposal. So everyone the campaign talked to, there's a record of that accrues from 2008 to 2010 during the midterm elections and now to 2012. So when volunteers are going out into the field, they're talking to people on the basis of how the campaign has sort of identified its targets based on how this knowledge has accrued over time of the electorate. What we're increasingly seeing too is that these national voter databases are used to create voter modeling. So campaigns need to figure out how can they most efficiently talk to the supporters that they want to talk to. And this goes back to demographics not being destiny, right? So campaigns need to figure out, well, who in our coalition do we need to make sure that we're actually reaching when we go door to door? We're pulling them out to the polls, and then we're actually seeing whether those people who said they would be early voting actually did and turn out at the polls. So a lot of the modeling that goes on by campaigns is figuring out how can we efficiently deploy volunteers to be doing things like pulling people out. And I'll say just a little bit more before I conclude and we get to the Q&A about now what we're increasingly seeing too is online network technologies being yoked to these door-to-door canvas efforts. So you see things like the Obama dashboard system, which the campaign rolled out this time. What's so interesting about that is that it essentially creates geographic-based teams of volunteers that people can log into. They can pull down walk lists. You can also access them on your iPhone. You can see a target set of voters. You can enter the data from your voter contact immediately into the phone. It gets synced with the voter file so that people in field offices can see what these volunteers are doing. And then also what you could do is if you're living, say, in a non-swing state, I moved out here from California, which wasn't a hotbed of presidential politics, but as an Obama supporter, for example, in Oakland, what you could do is dial into this online system and make calls into a swing state like Nevada, Colorado, or North Carolina. Essentially, campaigns can leverage the power of network technologies to build a vast national supporter network that can be doing things that are productive for the field campaign from the comfort of their own homes. So lowering the cost of doing those sorts of engagement and activities. And those are really the big trends that we're seeing, I think, now, and much more efficiently sort of doing a lot of the things and countering a lot of the other moves that the other panelists have talked about. So I'll stop there and then we can do
that's
Q&As.
perfect, yeah. Because we've got a good 15, 20 minutes here that we can field some questions and continue the conversation. So please let's ask the panelists some questions and, up front. Excellent. Go ahead.
Some of my questions going back to your last point. In the Obama campaign, or the Democratic Party, they essentially shut down all their machine that they had built for 2008 and 2010, because that seems like what happened, right? They got longer, even though they had these sophisticated operations that worked so well in 2008. So what happened?
That's a great empirical question.
So
the question was, what happened in 2010? Right, so the Democratic Party and the Obama campaign mobilize an enormous number of volunteers and drive turnout, and then in 2010, essentially that dissipates. So what happened? I would answer that by saying a couple of things happened simultaneously. First of all, I think that there was just a very natural diminishment of energy after Obama got into office. And let me say by what I mean by that, people were just tired. People worked nonstop for years, volunteering as precinct captains, as super volunteers. And after Obama gets into office, electoral politics, it's really difficult and it's exhausting. So I think folks were exhausting and that energy sort of ebbed a bit. I think on top of that, what you see a really a counter movement essentially on the right, and that's the Tea Party movement. And the Tea Party movement has the energy and enthusiasm in 2010. There's been some very recent political science research that has come out on this that suggests that they were very important electorally in terms of pulling out Republicans at the polls and getting them excited to vote. And I think that undercuts any of the organizing that happens around Organizing for America. I'll also say this, too, is that midterm elections are different than presidential elections. They're lower turnout, generally. I think that part of what matters is the electoral context in 2008. Obama was an exciting candidate. It was an exciting presidential election. The eyes of the nation were there. 2010 midterms play out in congressional elections across the country. There's no general national focus to sustain it in the same way. So couple that with just exhaustion, with counter-mobilization, and I think you put all that together, and what you have is you have less voter mobilization and less turnout in 2010 behind the president and his party than on the right as the challengers.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Gene. Yes.
Your question is very relevant to the question I was going to ask of Dan when I listened to his powerful presentation, which is, and I know what your answer would be because it has to be this, but when we think of these massively empowered field operations and very intense people-based involvement, which is a great boon for American politics, I have a little bit of a worry that, and this is as one who is, on one front, tried for many, many years to get young people heavily involved in politics. And that was like pulling teeth for most of my life. In 2008, it was a breeze. People were thrilled to participate. You just kind of had to show them which direction, which leads me to the sort of almost odd or cynical question. Might it be true that this great engagement is not so much only the process of new technologies and the like, but is very Barack Obama dependent? In 2008, great engagement among young people because they were so thrilled with Obama. Now I think it's possible that Republicans might have such powerful field operations because they hate Obama so much. But if Obama was not on the ballot, I could imagine Republicans not doing anything, much of anything, and I can imagine Democrats, young Democrats not doing much of anything because who even matters? And I think in 2010, I mean, I can remember saying to Democrats all the time, if you think all this energy is going to arise in 2010 when Obama's not on the ballot, you're missing the sort of magic of that campaign. So you could look at 2010 as a marker too, that, well, part of it was Obama wasn't on the ticket. And I don't know how much the world has changed technologically, and how much of it is this particular time in our history, which is so powerful.
Well, so I'll sort of share my favorite quote from the book, which comes from a senior staffer on the Obama campaign, who says something along the lines of, we didn't have to generate energy and enthusiasm very often. We made very smart decisions to keep it growing, but it was already there. And I think that's really the key to understanding the role of technology in electoral politics, right? At best, they translate that energy and enthusiasm into those really concrete resources that campaigns need. But in the absence of that energy and in the absence of that enthusiasm, I think campaigns can try very hard to do things like use social media to connect, to try to build that energy and enthusiasm, but it's very tough. And I think that's part of the environment that we're looking at in this campaign. And I think that one of the things the Obama campaign has been trying to do is say, how can we leverage this to build energy and enthusiasm, whether it's through mobilizing rhetoric, whether it's through, speaking to the base. Those are the sorts of the magic formulas that need to sort of
let me add a couple of thoughts here. When we were driving into Charlotte the other day, I mentioned to Kat, my wife, that I've gotten old enough that I even know the people whose names are on the highway signs. All of the politicians for whom highways are named, I used to know them, and I, which means that I'm old enough to have seen some cycles in politics. And one of the really embedded cycles is the two parties have grown more polarized and distrustful of each other, but they learn from each other. So in the mid '70s, Jesse Helms and what was then known as the Congressional Club comes up with this new thing: direct mail advertising, 4-page letters, stir up people, and they send him checks. A few years later, Democrats come up with this new idea: 4-page letters, stir up people and check. And you just see that over and over again, that one party takes the lead and the other party learns from it, and they keep leapfrogging each other. So it should be no surprise that as we go into 2012, the Romney campaign will be trying some things. I dare say the Romney campaign has read Dan's book and has learned from it. And the Obama campaign is going to learn some things from 2010. So I just want to say that. Another thing that occurs to me is this. One of the reasons I think that this voter mobilization that Dan has described, and some of the frustration that Gene has described about the lack of certain issues in the campaign, stems from the diminishment of daily journalism, particularly at the state and local level. Now, you can be tempted to overstate it, and I don't want to say that it's the fault of newspapers or the fault of, but there is less issue-driven coverage. There's still some investigative journalism, and there's still some very good campaign reporters out there. But if I were, heaven forbid, advising a candidate to run for office, you can't.
How to get his name on the highway sign.
Right.
That's right. I know how to get them on the highway sign. I'm not sure how to get them in the newspaper. You can't rely on the mass media to drive your campaign. The mass media is more of a referee, more of a scorekeeper. That plots and this is particularly at the state and local level. There is still some healthy journalism at the national level, but even at the national level, most of that journalism is through the filter of opinion or analysis rather than what we used to call straight reporting. And so I think we also have to take into consideration the media environment when we are thinking about political organizing or how much certain issues are raised.
Yeah, we have like 2 minutes left. Kareem, did you want to open it up? Okay, I just want to make sure. Oh, yes. Is that a follow-up?
I have no question, but I guess briefly, with so many people who are poor now and the rise of poverty in the U.S., it seems to me that the field might be open for the rise of a true populist politician, because at some point someone's going to realize that they can appeal to those people and encourage them to vote, just like in Latin America.
It ain't gonna happen.
Chavez or,
It ain't gonna happen. That's been going on in Southern politics. I teach Huey Long. I know that. Alternet had an article about it. I can show you articles going back for generations. It's time for a populist to arise. It doesn't happen. Every now and then a Huey Long comes along and flames out. And the rise of the metropolitan South makes it even less likely for a genuine populist campaign. It might be nice to have it, but I'm just telling you, the history of the South doesn't lend much support. You can have a progressive campaign, and I don't mean progressive as a substitute for liberal. I mean progressive in the classic 1920s sense of reformist, modernizing government. But almost every attempt to pull off a populist campaign crashes on the rocks of cultural differences and quirks in candidates and all of that. And
See,
Yeah.
It's
another
just hard
thing
to happen.
Another thing that happens, one thing that happens when you get really old is you know all the highway signs. Another is that you get sufficiently cynical that you give up on the American dream and American political process. And that's what Ferrell's just announced to you, is that there's no chance that the people in the bottom half economically would actually rise up and demand to be part of this democracy. I think Ferrell has history on his side, but if the American democracy is not to be lost, then we have to hope for a different future. What's happened to me in old age, I've spent a lot of my life working and thinking it would be great to try and talk wealthier people, one way or another, in whatever capacity, into being more generous to those at the bottom. I've spent a lot of effort on that, whether it's in public policy or in education or the like. The old man in me now thinks that ain't going to happen. You're right. That Frederick Douglass is ultimately right, and that the result comes only from the demand and the requirement. So what we need in the United States is a politics in which the bottom, at least 51%, assert their engagement in powerful and potent ways and assert their economic interest. This is a democracy. There's no sort of theoretical reason that the bottom 55% would be taken out of the electoral calculus. I admit that's what we have and what we've had most of the time, but I hope for a better future than you do, Ferrell.
Yes. We've got like one more minute, so go ahead.
I want to follow up with the idea, even if it is a metropolitan South, can't you form coalitions in the cities? Do you just, you can just forget those farmers who used to be part of that coalition and build new coalitions, Hispanic people.
So is there a way to maximize the metropolitan South as a way to form coalitions?
Can I be the young and dumb person on the panel for a moment? And I say that in quotation marks because actually I think in response to both questions, history is what it is until it's not. And I think often it takes people who are dumb enough not to pay too much attention to history to think that something like that is possible. Frankly, that was at least that little ragtag group of people that started the Obama campaign probably included a good number of folks like that. I think that actually part of the story has to be about changing the election system. Most massive social movements have involved changes that allow more and different kinds of people to be engaged in the political process. As entrenched as the story that Ferrell and Gene to some degree have rightly pointed out, there are a good number of people in our region of the country that don't vote, or in some cases can't vote. There are two things that are hanging out there that still haven't been responded to. I'll just offer them as potential places of development. One, we still have not resolved a national immigration policy. It's a huge number of people who at some point or another may be involved in the political system. And two, it goes back to the poverty point. We haven't figured out how to make voting an accessible opportunity for everybody regardless of their place in life. And I think if we are able to organize efforts to do those things, it may not come from the two major parties. The more likely it is that these interests that haven't been considered at all at least get incorporated into the conversation. Still, we haven't written the full story about whether that's going to be successful, but it's out there.
Thank you. We're going to have to wrap it up there, but thank you very much.